Yeah, let's welcome Chris on stage.
Thank you very much, Lars. So, hi, my name's Chris Pilsworth, as Lars said. Here to talk about static site generation. It's really about kind of taking some of the complexity out of the runtime of AEM site hosting and keeping things simple. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an independent solution architect and engineer. I've been working with Adobe Professional Services at some of their customer sites over the last few years, primarily in the sort of automotive industry, where I originally started my career working for companies like Volkswagen and Mercedes, but most recently in financial services types of organizations. So what is static site generation? So it's basically generating the sites before they are visited ahead of time. Instead of rendering those pages when they're first visited, as would normally happen with AEM, where you'd create those pages on the author, push those out to the publish, and then when that first request comes in, rendering those and potentially caching those on the dispatcher. So, but why would we do this? So let me give you a little bit of background against some of the problems that we encountered and challenges that we faced over the last couple of years in hosting websites for one of the customers we've been working with. So the challenge for us was, unlike many application development projects where we're kind of building a series of components and templates and publishing those sites, instead this time around we were kind of building a platform. So this platform had to be host many sites for those customers for a collection of brands in many countries. There was also a number of teams that were actually doing the development onto these sites. So those teams were dispersed internationally in parts of Asia and Europe and all over the place. And each of those teams were kind of focused on a slice of the website. The idea was that these were cross-functional teams that had responsibility over a certain section of that site. So those business lines could develop their work independently rather than relying on a centralized IT team to develop those on their behalf. So what that meant was that for each of those individual websites, there was the work of many, many teams, and each of those applications were deployed, would create a global product which would be deployed across all of those. And lastly, that platform was deployed into multiple regions, so we had to host this through Europe and the Americas and Asia. So each of those deployments were then kind of reproduced into each of those regions, and we tried as much as possible to keep those software versions involved, those in sync. So where we started, much like any typical deployment of AEM or CQ before it that you would have seen before, so we'll have an author instances, we'd have a number of publish instances, and for each of those a dispatcher, and those will be kind of, depending upon the capacity needs of that particular site, we kind of scale those up. So we had quite a few publishers and dispatchers in each of those regions. So there's a certain amount of work to sort of keep all of that going. So what we found is we started to come across some of the problems relating to multi-tenancy because of all of these teams working on an agile basis, deploying every couple of weeks. There was possibly sort of 15 to 20 teams all deploying independently and regularly. We had to kind of deal with some of the challenges of multi-tenancy. So there's some things that worked out really, really well. So that we thought might be a problem. So OSGI provided a great way of modularizing their work. And actually, even within Sling itself, the namespace supported in there gave a great way of kind of partitioning the work of those teams into the various app spaces. So whether it's under apps, or components, or templates, etc. And then within the kind of MSM model within AEM as well, we've had obviously the the ability to kind of partition their work into various site sections, and they could roll those out. There's some things that didn't work quite so well. So one of the problems that we faced initially was around author customization. Teams had extended some components on things like rich text editor via the normal extension mechanisms. What we found is that would kind of leak from one implementation into the other and cause a few problems. But there's things that we can manage with. The real challenge, though, we faced was that when all of this went live into production, that the problems around kind of resource sharing and contention were found. So if one team deployed some code which had very high requirements in terms of memory, that could potentially affect those other teams. So similarly, if they had high resources on memory, that could have the same thing. So the danger here was that the work of one team or for one site could bring down the platform as it was for hosting in those other environments. And in this kind of financial services environment where things are highly kind of regulated, there was a lot of focus on keeping those services up and running. So like all AEM websites, we rely upon caching for the best performance and scalability of that site. We wanted to kind of keep the need for runtime processing to the minimum on those sites. So we saw cache hit ratios of high 90s, let's say, which is not unusual in its own way. We're able to kind of offload a lot of the requirements for user data and transactional elements because they were coming through a separate kind of API platform that was available. So as an architectural principle for the platform itself, we kind of said, you need to aim for very high levels of customization, caching on that page, for no user customization, and we kind of keep those pages getting served out of the cache. So generally, the platform has been really good. It's acted really well. We've not had any major outages, but we've had a few wobbles, and those wobbles are typically focused around deployment time, because we've got so many teams deploying on such a regular basis, and when they are deploying, we having to potentially flush all the pages because they may be affected by component changes and the resources associated with those. So for high traffic sites, this is caused us some problems on some occasions where perhaps responses were delayed where we wouldn't want that to happen. And also, as a platform, it's been difficult for us to manage things like stat levels on the site, so to minimize the effect of content publishing cache flushes as well. So this was another area, particularly where people were making very regular updates through the day on very high traffic sites. There was a kind of a stress on the publish instances, so we had to make sure there was a lot of capacity there enabled to serve those sites. Another problem is that we found is that because this site is up and running and we're relying upon the publish instances, then when it comes time to do things like upgrades or patching on those servers, particularly upgrades, you kind of need to coordinate a bunch of teams to say, right, we're moving from 6.x to 6.y. They all need to kind of organize themselves, down tools, get ready for the upgrade. Plus, we need to spin up that parallel infrastructure to be able to support that new version. So that was another real difficulty, just scheduling these things, but also providing the additional infrastructure to do that as well. So one of the solutions that we've been experimenting with over the last few months is to pre-render those sites ahead of publishing. As for the sites in general, it shouldn't make a tremendous amount of difference because they weren't relying on a lot of that dynamic functionality that AEM can offer. But what we do is to serve that site through web storage with CDN layered on top. What this effectively should enable us to do is to remove some of that runtime dependency on AEM. So, and where we have that need, where we can meet that through, for dynamic content, we can meet that through sort of API integration at the front end or through implementing a kind of servers layer on top of that. So whether that's AWS Lambda or maybe something like Adobe I/O. Okay. So AEM has supported, or CQ before it has supported static content generation since the very early in days, maybe its inception. Content sync is one of those tools that provides that. This is a kind of pull model. So the content sync was originally there for AEM mobile and allows you to generate a kind of static representation of your site. It can either do that as a full definition of your site or incremental updates. So great component within AEM. It's very flexible. It allows you to define what goes into your site, and so you can customize what gets output in your static packages. It's also extensible as well. So there's documented extension points. So if you can't reproduce your site in an offline mode, you can extend that in certain ways to make sure that you can customize it and generate the page as it was. But when we tried to use this, we hit a few problems. One of the problems were the fact that this was used relative URLs. So content sync, I think, was originally designed to with like a phone gap in mind. So when that content was downloaded, it would be packaged up, delivered to a mobile device, and then viewed like from the local file system on that mobile device. So the content URLs were all relative URLs, so they'd all feature the full path, so content, application, etc., and then references between those would all be, dot content, etc. So this was a problem with rewriting. It does seem as though it's possible to kind of customize that, but from what we could see, this was kind of within the APIs of content sync. And the other thing we were worried about as well was the kind of licensing aspect of this. It's up until now been a part of the AEM mobile, which I think is now kind of defunct within AEM, but more recently it seems to be associated with screens, so it wasn't entirely clear how this was licensed. Also, you may have seen the static replication agent when looking at the replication agents. Static replication agent is a really useful little tool. What that'll do is just listen for any replication events and output those output those pages down to the file system. So it uses a set of rules to take those paths and to convert those into URLs, which are then called against localhost, and then the output of that is then dropped down to the file system. So this is quite useful. It was somewhat limited in certain ways though. So where you've got assets that are output, which are kind of directly related to their path, this works really well. So you can grab here the We Retail content path, add a HTML extension, and put it into design mode, and that will render that page with the preview mode enabled and drop that down to the file system. So that's all good. Where there are problems is where there are kind of virtual URLs which aren't directly based on those resources. So where you've got things like, for example, client libs, which are under apps, app client lib. Now those URLs would need to be mapped across to etc client libs, and then the path of the thing. And there's not really the capacity here to remap portions of those URLs onto new requests. Also, all these requests would be kind of made back to the AEM instance through the local host. So it meant that if you want to output the full path pages of your site, then that's okay. But in nearly all situations, you'd shorten those when they're actually published. So you wouldn't want to see the full content URLs within there. So this again comes back, I guess, to the conversation that Stefan was having about URL rewriting. That's one of the key issues with them. Okay, so what we decided to do was basically do a kind of a custom replication agent. Now, this replication agent was similar to the static agent, but what it did was supplement those requests and so when it made requests back to AEM, it would include the host header, so it could go through all the normal mechanisms for Sling mapping. So when those pages were output, they would effectively be very similar to as if the request had come through from a visitor via the dispatcher. So you could get those process URLs, you could output those pages as if they would come through on the live site. Also, in this particular case, we made it so that it uploaded directly to S3. So there's no kind of intermediate storage on file systems, no worrying about instances. That would immediately go through to web storage. And similar to the static agent, but slightly different, there was a sort of, slightly more flexible mechanism for URL mapping. So you could use regexes and groups to kind of pick apart those paths and transform those into a set of URLs that come through. So when we compare that to static publishing, what changes? Well, excuse my basic slides, but so it meant that at runtime we could remove the need for those publish instances, remove the need for all those dispatcher instances, of which there were many, and kind of remove some of the reliance upon the networking infrastructure as well, like load balancers and such like. And what turned out is in the kind of pilot that we ran was something much simpler. You could publish those pages directly to S3 and then layer on Cloudfront on top of that to host your site. Within Cloudfront, to get the URLs to work, we had a within that distribution, we had to have the S3 bucket, which contained all the content, but then have multiple origins which mounted that at different points. So the S3 bucket there's not quite right, but so by default you'd map to the content root. So if you had content static app en, that would be you'd be mapped at that level. But then for requests that came through with full paths, you'd come map to the root of that bucket. So you'd be able to request etc client libs or content dam URLs through those through that site. So that looked a little bit like this. So on the Cloudfront side, there was basically just a reference to a single content bucket with all of the content included. We'd have the this single static hosting bucket, but then also another origin that mapped to exactly the same bucket with a different mount point for where the root of that particular site was. And then a number of behaviors that mapped upon this. So what the behaviors would do for Cloudfront is to map inbound URLs back to those specific origins. So you could say by default you'd map to that the site root, but for those other paths we had like content dam and etc client libs, they would go basically to the root bucket. And within the error pages you could design that there. So there's a number of benefits in doing this, obviously. We've got lower cost in terms of running publish instances, fewer licenses to support those publish instances as well. But the main thing here was around kind of support costs. It's around not having people looking at networking and AEM experts and Unix experts and storage, etc. All of those people kind of on hand 24 hours a day to make sure that these platforms are up and running. A lot of those worries kind of go away when you've got a much simpler at the point of delivery architecture. From a security perspective, it's quite desirable. There's less moving parts, less surface area, I suppose, with which you can be affected by security issues. At the end of the day, we're kind of just serving up pages in this respect. So obviously, you've still got those concerns where you've got the serverless elements of this that could go into the site delivery. One of the main differences was around first load performance. So where we had those problems, typically what we'd see if the platform was struggling was that things would start to slow down. Those requests would start to extend. So in this case, we've got all of those pages pre-rendered. So it really didn't make much difference to users when they arrived. So come rain or shine, when things are being published, it didn't really matter. They still got those pages in roughly the same timing. And obviously, because we've not got quite so many instances to manage, and quite so many kind of hosts to run. And we're relying upon very kind of resilient and durable services like S3 and Cloudfront. Then it has a lot of benefits in terms of the availability and resilience on those sites. But there's a few limitations as well. So, what hosting static pages, that's great if you can live within those constraints on your sites. But there's a few things you need to do to get a basic site up and running. So one of the first obvious ones is that you need to be able to serve custom headers out of that origin. So Cloudfront in particular allows edge lambdas to modify the response to visitors. So if you need to add security headers like HSTS or content security policies or any of those sorts of things, you can add those through viewer response edge lambdas. Similarly with redirects, if you've got vanity paths or site redirects on site, you can use those edge lambdas to load up a definition of that from that bucket and to direct customers and provide that sort of functionality on top of the static sites for paths which don't exist or need to be remapped. Obviously, that leaves you with the need to do things like to manage form submissions and validation. Now here you need to kind of either delegate that to a third service or to handle those sorts of requests with a serverless solution, something like Lambda again or Adobe I/O perhaps. Authentication, the good thing here is that there's lots of solutions out there for providing authentication on top of these static sites. So things like Okta and GeoSec and AWS Cognito. So you can layer these servers on top of your static site to provide that kind of authentication functionality if that's needed as well. There's been a kind of, I suppose, a campaign or a kind of a theme in the front-end development communities at the moment which has got the name Jamstack. That's got not a great name, but it stands for JavaScript APIs and markup. So this really focuses on static asset hosting at the back end using services like Zeit and Netlify and so on, integrating with SaaS service style integrations for the dynamic parts of the site. With typically leveraging the sort of rich client-side applications like Angular or React or Vue for those things. So this is great because this kind of movement has kind of enriched the ecosystem and created a simple way to deliver very scalable and reliable sites. And it's a fantastic experience for developers who are creating sites. But that's not always the case where we've got customers of AEM. Those customers still need to retain that content authoring experience. They still need to be able to build pages visually, prepare those pages. They still need publishing workflows for approval and sign-off and those sorts of things. And content translation and asset management as well. So we still need to keep AEM in the picture here for those kind of Jamstack architectures. A lot of those are very developer oriented. They're fine if you don't mind managing your content in Markdown in Git, for example, but they're not great if you've got business users who need to sign on with their desktop. And kind of work as part of a business workflow. Okay. So unfortunately, I've not been able to share exactly what we worked on with this customer because of the sort of nature of their business. But I have at least prepared a demo which sort of should give you an idea of how that works. So I've kind of knocked together a kind of re-implementation of this along similar lines with the AEM archetype project. So hopefully that'll be okay. Let me just see if I can sort displays. I can work out how to do this. Okay, so let's push that onto there. Okay, I'm going to struggle to do this now. No, sorry, I'm not actually sure how to exchange the screens here. Okay, all right, maybe I'll need to leave that demo for today. But so effectively what we've got is a S3 replication agent. That will just listen for any replication events. What that does is take a set of rules which map those inbound URLs, and it will do each of those replication agents can have all the host kind of metadata applied. So when that event comes through for those resources, it will make those requests back to AEM, generate those pages, and then immediately upload those to S3. So once the Cloudfront pattern is in place, you see that within a fraction of a second, your pages are updated, static pages on the website. So, so what I've done so far is to kind of do a re-implementation of this pattern without all of the kind of customer-specific things there. But there's still kind of a lot of information, a lot of kind of extensions that need to be there. So, for example, metadata for incremental build. So, under normal circumstances, with your publish instances and dispatchers, we would have the stat level would kind of invalidate the cache on a wider level, and you'd find those pages recached. So in order to do it this way, you need something a little bit more like content sync, which can actually look for relationships between those pages and regenerate sets of pages based upon those changes. So it's working out those page associations, what you need to rebuild when things changes. I think there's also scope for doing kind of a Git-style replication agent here, so at least for the markup content, not for assets so much. I think there's a great possibility for, rather than just uploading everything each time it changes, doing that more on an incremental basis based upon what's actually changing on the site, potentially for IPFS as well. So, in conclusion, it's not for every site, only if you're in the situation where you can live with a set of constraints. It's certainly getting easier to make static sites now. It's getting more useful as you can integrate these kind of serverless services into the platform. But there's great potential, I think, for simplifying the way that these things work. Okay, so I'm planning to kind of open source this, what we've done so far in terms of the Cloudfront template, some of the serverless aspects around this, around lambdas, and also for the obviously for the replication agent as well. So I'm going to try to release that shortly. It's not quite ready yet, but if you've got an interest in this, or you've got similar ideas, or you've done this before and taken a different approach, please feel free to get in contact on any of those channels. Thank you very much.